Mr. President, I come to the floor this afternoon to express my deep opposition to the nomination of Mr. William Barr to be our nation's next Attorney General. His nomination comes at a very trying time for our country, as our own president frequently twists the truth and constantly pushes the limits of the law. The American people deserve to know the Attorney General, the top law enforcement officer in the country, is committed above all else to seeking truth, defending their civil and constitutional rights, administering justice on their behalf, and safeguarding our country against threats to our democracy. Mr. President, I wish Mr. Barr was the person who could right the ship and stand up for the American people no matter what. I wish he was the person who could help guide our country through this critical juncture when questions about illegal payments involving both the Trump campaign and the Trump Inaugural Committee and Russia's interference in our elections and its attempts to influence millions of our friends and families must be fully explained to the public. We know this is an administration that finds it so difficult to follow the law that is being investigated in multiple jurisdictions at the federal levels, all of which would be overseen by Mr. Barr. Sadly, it has become abundantly clear Mr. Barr is incapable of being the impartial Attorney General that people in communities across our country need and deserve, and someone who stands up to the president when he's wrong. Now, Mr. President, based on what I've seen over the past 2 years, and despite the critical time we are in, I don't expect many of my Republican colleagues to join me on the floor today in order to defeat this nomination, though people across the country have been raising red flags on this nomination. My Republican colleagues have been busy building the glide path for Mr. Barr's nomination. In fact, just last week, the majority leader standing here on the Senate floor left little doubt about whether the majority would try to get this nomination sewn up. The leader referred to Mr. Barr as a tried and true public servant and a proven professional who was applying for the same job he got in 1991 under President George H.W. Bush. The job description, the majority leader said, and I quote, remains exactly the same as it was years ago. But Mr. President, that's the problem. Senate Republicans are still operating as though it's the early 1990s, as if the world around them had not changed, as if what we have experienced for the past 2 years is normal. Well, on behalf of the American people, I urge us all to wake up. For the past 2 years, we've had a president whose only consistent agenda items are self-preservation and self-dealing, whether that means flouting the law or disregarding ethics, acting with impunity, violating norms and destroying relationships with our allies, firing those who challenge him and bullying those he can't, threatening jail time for political opponents, and changing federal policy by tweet and based on his current mood. On top of all that, President Trump faces a number of investigations, including serious questions about whether he has obstructed justice in order to make the special counsel's investigation into Russia's meddling in our elections go away. That's the same special counsel investigation that has already resulted in 34 indictments or guilty pleas to date. Despite what the president would like us to believe, that's far from a witch hunt. So when President Trump's first choice to be the next Attorney General is someone with highly questionable views on executive power, we have to be on alert. When that nominee, Mr. Barr, can't adequately explain why, out of the blue, he sent a memo to the White House in order to criticize the special counsel investigation, absolve the president of questions about obstruction of justice, and make a case for less accountability with this president, we ought to be on the alert. When Mr. Barr writes that President Trump has, quote, complete authority to start or stop a law enforcement proceeding, we ought to be on alert. Mr. Barr's memo makes no sense unless it was an audition for this job. And that is absolutely not how any president should select an attorney general. And when we know that if confirmed, Mr. Barr would be in charge of the special counsel investigation and decide what, if anything, the public gets to know about the findings on Russia's 26th election meddling, we ought to be on the alert. Someone who has written such an obviously flawed analysis of the investigation should not be put in charge of overseeing the investigation. That is just common sense. Mr. President, people across this country sent us here to Congress not to shield the president from the law, but to help restore integrity and independence to the federal government, to provide a check on the executive branch as outlined in the Constitution. And the idea that any member of this Senate would support an Attorney General nominee who has openly and unequivocally advocated for less accountability when it comes to President Trump, that's just wrong. And the American people will not stand for it. So to any of my colleagues who plan to support this nomination, I have a message. Seize this opportunity while you can to make it very clear to Mr. Barr and the Trump administration you believe the American people deserve to know for sure the findings on Russia's 26th election meddling will be made public in order to get them the answers they deserve, and that any attempt to cover up or hinder or otherwise muddy the waters around the Mueller investigation would be a serious disservice to the people that we represent and will only lead to the further erosion of trust in our institutions and our ability to work on their behalf. The president is not above the law, not in the White House, not in New York, not anywhere. So Mr. Barr may be the Attorney General this president wants, someone to shield him from serious questions about abuse of power, someone who believes a president should be able to do more or less whatever he or she wants. But Mr. Barr is certainly not, in my opinion, the Attorney General this country needs, which is someone who will stand up for the rights of everyone else. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.